Hi, everyone. My name is Marisa Thompson, and I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today. This is our Ready, Set, Grow series. So Jeff Anderson is our speaker today, and Jeff is the Horticulture Extension Agent for Doña County down in Las Cruces. And anybody who knows Jeff or has worked with him before knows that we are very privileged to have him speaking with us today. And we all look forward to your presentation, Jeff.
Thank you, Marissa. Okay, so we're going to talk about the right tree in the right place. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard about that, and this is important to remember. We don't want to put something that is going to get too large and too small a place and vice versa in your designs. So some of the things to consider for proper tree selection and planting is your soil type. And usually when somebody calls in, I'll ask them, where do you live? So in Doña County here, I as the agent here, I know about our soils and how the different soils are across the valley. And so that's important that you can consult with your agent in your county, that he or she will better understand what your soils are and be able to help you out in selecting different things. But so if I ask somebody, well, where do you live? I know if they live on the mesa, they probably have sandy soils. They live in the valley, they may have clay soils or mixtures of that, but depending on the area they're coming from, I understand what those soils are like. So that's one thing. You want to know where a person lives, where do you live, and you can figure out your soil type. And there is a NRCS soil web survey that you can actually go to that will describe your soil type. It's a little bit difficult site to work. You probably need somebody to help you. Even myself, I need people to help me at times. And then to interpret it, you need somebody that understands what it's actually saying. So, but it's a very good site. The depth, most trees root anywhere from 2 to 3 feet deep. So you need a soil that's going to be around 36 inches deep. Most trees have shallower roots. They're not like we think of a lot of times where you see the tree on the top and it looks the same underneath the ground, and that's not true. So we'll look at that as well. We need to know your texture of your soil, whether you have sand, silt, or clay, like I mentioned with the soil type. The compaction and drainage. So if you had a brand new house built in, like if you're in the valley with clay soil and you had heavy equipment running over it, or there was a former roadbed there, or who knows what happened to it, it all got very compacted. You may have drainage issues. So, you need to know what kind of compaction you have and what's going on. Also, you need to know whether there's caliche underneath there. So those are important things. Your pH, generally most of the soils in New Mexico here have a pretty high pH, around 8, somewhere there. I've seen ones up to 9 or higher, and some down around 7. Now, if you're up in the mountains, it could be even, lower. It could be closer to 6 if you're lucky. I actually saw somebody's garden here in Las Cruces, and they had done so many amendments for so long. Their pH was 4.5. I didn't think that would ever be possible. And they were wondering why they were having problems growing things, because their pH was so low. Salinity, there's a lot of problems around New Mexico with salinity, and our waters can be salty, and especially in drought. And the more water you add, it leaves salt residues behind. So we have to understand, if you have compaction, poor drainage, and high pHs and salinity, you could have really problem soils for trying to grow almost anything. And fertility, whether you have the right elements in the soil. Some of the sandy soils we've had analyzed around here have nothing in the soil. Believe it or not, there's nothing there except for one thing. That one thing was sodium. They had plenty of sodium, but nothing else. So generally sandy soils don't hang on to nutrition at all or water very well. So we want to be climate smart in your tree choice. That's very important. Our climate is changing, and that is a fact. We are getting more extremes in our weather. We just had snow and really super freezing temperatures a few weeks ago. And then right now we're up in the 80s. So our climate's up and down and all over the place. Up to before the snow, we only had in Las Cruces area, we had only 3 inches of rain, 3.05 if you count the 05. And then we had some snow, so that we haven't had much rain. And if anybody's seen Elephant Butte Reservoir, you can see it looks just really bad. It's at the bottom. There's only 4.3 or 4.5% water capacity in there currently. Choose trees for what our climate will be like in 20 or 30 to 50 years. That's one of the suggestions. So if you're going to plant a tree now, you want to look at what the weather, the climate, if it's changing, what it's going to be like. So if you're getting hotter, warmer, and drier, you want to plan for those events. We want to make sure we choose those trees, obviously, that tolerate more heat and more drought. New Mexico is getting farther and farther into more drought conditions. The Rio Grande Basin up in Colorado is not getting as much snow, so we're getting very drought stressed here. And the smart choice for the future is going to be to grow those drought tolerant trees. So we need to discover and find which ones are best for our area. Here's the current USDA map of the United States and our climate. You can see Las Cruces is in a zone 8, and we're actually in a zone 8A, and up towards Albuquerque, you're in a zone 7. They used to consider us as being in the same climate zone. I know different parts of Albuquerque are pretty warm, so they match some of our climates here, and same thing with Silver City. Surprisingly, how warm Silver City is compared to Deming. Silver City can be warmer than Deming. So know your climate. We need to choose the right spot to plant our trees. So the first thing you should do before you say, oh, I'm just going to go out and plant this tree, you need to go out and figure out the spot where you're going to put it. So if you want a tree in a specific area, what you should do is go out there and look up, look down, and look all around. The reason for that is because trees grow up with their trunks. And if you're right underneath power lines, that's going to be a big issue. If you're right underneath the overhanging edge of a building, that's a problem. Or any other structures or things that might be in the way. Those branches grow out, and what is the ultimate spread of that tree? Is it going to be pushing branches into your house or pushing branches into your neighbors? And we'll talk about that later. And down, those roots grow down. What's underneath the ground where these trees are going to grow? So you got to think about where you're going to put that tree, what's in every direction, up, down, sides, and down, around, everywhere there. So you're going to be watching out for buildings, power lines, overhead utilities, buried utilities such as gas, water, electrical, sewer, all these things, sidewalks, right-of-ways, your neighbors. Don't plant next to existing trees. I've seen this on many landscape plans where, especially in commercial operations, where they never walk the site, nobody ever looks at the piece of property, and they'll put a tree right on the edge of the property because it looks good on the design. But if you go out and look at this is why you need to go out and look at places right across the fence, there's a fully mature, maybe a mulberry tree or an oak tree there. And so why on earth would you try to squeeze in another full-size tree when 5 feet away, you already have a full-size tree? So you need to consider those things in your design. And I know there are requirements as to how many trees sometimes you have to put on a piece of property, but you need to look at the whole thing and make adjustments where it's important to do so. Talk to your neighbors. You don't want to face future lawsuits. So there are some trees, and we're going to talk about that too. There's some really bad weedy type trees, and that varies in different areas of the state. Some are real weak and grow real fast and they break. And if you plant a tree on the property line and it grows up and it falls over because it's weak and infected with disease and insects in a short period of time and falls on your neighbor's house, guess who's responsible? You are. You're going to be responsible for that. So you don't want to plant a future problem. Consider the security. Nowadays, we have to think about that. So if you've got a tree blocking a street light, that's important for you. So when you come home at night and you get out of your car, and it doesn't matter if you're a man or woman, you can get attacked just as easily. I shouldn't say just as easily, but people getting attacked. So you want to make sure you leave those things open. Yes, Marisha.
Yeah, Mary Lee posted a question pertaining to this. She asked, if I have an existing ash that shades the back of our house and it's nearing the end of its life, what things do I need to consider?
The health of the tree. If it's real healthy, and how do you know it's nearing the end of its life? What are the signs of that? Is it got borers in it? Is it rotting in places? Has it been topped and you got rotting branches or breaking branches? Is it not getting enough water? I know that ash trees require quite a bit of water, and people don't think about that. So when you look at cottonwoods and ashes, they use anywhere from 125 to 250 gallons of water a day during the summer period. And that's a lot of water, and whether you're going to be able to meet those needs. as pretty as they are. So in southern part of the New Mexico here, trees like cottonwoods and willows and a lot of the ashes don't work out really well here because of the short growing season. They don't go dormant enough, they outgrow, they grow too fast, and then they face problems with insects and disease. So yeah, you have to consider what's going on with the tree right now. I don't know what you mean by what's the end of the life of the tree. So if it's a problem because it's been mismanaged and not watered enough, that could signal it needs to come down and be removed. And look at it this way, if you're removing that tree, it's exciting because you could plant something new, maybe something better. Yes, you're losing a shade tree, but look at what you can do. And for safety reasons, you may have to remove it. And remember also how cute it looked when it was small. What happened? So make sure you do your research. I had one person years ago tell me they bought these little trees, and I called me out to the property and they said, "What's wrong with them?" And I looked at him and I said, "There's nothing wrong with them." He goes, "Well, look how big they're getting." He goes, "I only paid 99 cents. And I said, "Price doesn't dictate how big the tree is going to get. You look at the giant redwoods, the seed falls freely on the ground and they can grow over to 200-300 feet tall. So, price doesn't dictate how big that tree is going to get." Anyway, this is a recommendation that you can find online from your utilities and that. Some general recommendations for planting from utilities. And you can see on the right-hand side, if you're going to plant trees over by utility poles, you want to make sure that the mature height is less than 25 feet. So there are a number of dwarfer like redbuds and crab apples and things that might work in there if you really need to plant a tree in that right of way. And that's highly discouraged because if you plant it there and the utility needs to get through, they can come in and cut it down. So be wary of that. You want to make sure you plant it anywhere from 20 to 25 feet away from utilities like that. I know if you drive around a lot of cities, you're going to see people that planted Afghan pines, like in Las Cruces here, you'll see Afghan pines and they grow 40, 60 feet tall and they plant right under the utilities. And of course, they're going to be topped off and hacked to pieces. There's actually an Italian stone pine. I know there's some in Albuquerque, but there's an Italian stone pine on the New Mexico State University's campus here. And it's got a trunk probably 4 feet in diameter, and it was under the power lines. And so it got topped and then they let it grow and then they cut off the side and it looks horribly bad. They should just probably remove the whole thing. That would be a better option. Here's a typical root structure. This one happens to be a London plane tree, which is a sycamore, but most trees have this type of root structure. So they're pretty close to the surface and they radiate out from the tree. So what supports the tree? If the tree's roots are only 2 to 3 feet deep, what supports it? And what supports it actually is the spread of the roots. The farther they spread out, the wider the base. You can do that experiment at home. You got a narrow base and you put a top heavy bunch of flowers in there, it's going to fall over. You got a wide based base, it's not going to tip over very easily. You have to really knock it to have it fall over. So, if you have a root structure like this, and then you plant it in a narrow area, you could run into some really bad problems when you restrict the roots. So be aware of the root system. There are some trees that put down really deep roots, like Chinese pistache. Some of the oak trees will put down pretty good roots, and mesquite and things like that. Yes, Marissa.
Yeah, I think Sophia, so she mentions that she has cherry trees on Ruidoso Mountain, and that they have, I think she's saying they have roots growing from the bottom of the trunk and they're located in clay soil. So what should she consider? I think she's talking potentially about suckers. Sophia, if you can clarify, yeah.
So yeah, if you got heavy clay soil and the roots can't grow down into it, you have to have air in your soil. So that's something to mention here. You need to have air. If you have no air in the deeper depths of your soil, so you can have heavy clay and it's 2 to 3 feet deep. But if it's so heavy that no air gets in there, roots can't survive. So they're going to grow up near the surface, and you're going to see roots sprouting around, especially if there's moisture. You'll see roots that seem to sprout pretty close around the base of the trunk. And that's roots trying to stabilize itself there. what you need to do is somehow look at providing better drainage. And I know in pecan country here, what they do is they go in and they either with a backhoe or a big auger drill and drill down through the clay layers to sand. So, up in Ruidoso there, I'm not sure what's underneath it. You may run into rock. So you might not be able to go down through it, but those roots form as a matter of drainage. So hopefully that helps you. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, there's the root structure. So tree canopies for walkability in city streets reduce the heat island effect. So when we're in the cities, when you're out in the country, you don't have to worry about some of this stuff. But in our cities, we need stuff like this. So 2 years ago, I was in Washington, D.C., and I was really impressed with the way the city streets are. They're wide and they're nice, and they have these great big red oaks. These are red oaks on there, and they're thriving, and you see how beautiful it is to walk under the shade of them. Now, Washington, D.C., it cools a bit. It's still hot and humid there, but it's better than being out and hot and humid in the full sun. But it helps to have street trees like this. I know Albuquerque's been working hard on having street trees. And one of the big things is we got to choose the right trees. It's very difficult to find the perfect trees. They look at the situation with sidewalk, people walking all the time. Where's the water coming from? The utilities underground, the buildings on the side, and stand up to all this and pollution and everything else. So, you need to consider this. This is kind of like your house in a much bigger scale, but things that you have to stop and think about. Here's another view in Washington there. Be nice to have streets like this in New Mexico where we could walk down, go through streets like this. Seen them in quite a few states. Okay, selecting the right tree. Just because they sell it in your area doesn't mean it grows there. I hear that all the time. I went to one of the box stores and, they sold me this tree. And I'm like, but it doesn't grow here. And they're like, but they sold it there. And I'm like, just because they sell it doesn't mean it grows there. So we had one of my neighbors planted down the street from me queen palms. He bought it at the box store, and I stopped in one day and I said, they don't grow here. It was queen palms and pygmy date palms. They looked really pretty, and there were about probably 12 feet tall. They brought them in here, and I'm like, but they're not going to grow here. So anyway, he planted them this year. We'll see how far that goes this year when they finally freeze to death. They sell azaleas. Okay, they don't really grow here unless you live up in the mountains where you got a more acidic soil somewhere in New Mexico. Generally, most places, they're not going to grow here because our soil is too acidic. Same thing with blueberries. Blueberries need a pH of about 4.5. So it's not impossible to grow here if you supply the acidic conditions, but it's something to think about. With restrictions in water and your soil type, why fight against nature? Look for things that thrive and do beautifully here. Even though the climate zones across the US may have the similarity, like you look in Maryland or in the Carolinas, it says zone 8 or zone 7, which is the same as we have here, but their soils are different. So the things that they can grow here, like the azaleas, like I was saying, or some of the other trees like dogwood trees and that, they may not thrive here because of the soil differences. So then you got to decide those particular things. So don't believe everything you see at the store. And then you want to check and see, what do you want? What do I want? Do I want a shade tree? Do I want an ornamental tree? Do I want a flowering tree, fruiting tree? Do I want to attract wildlife? Or you just want to meet the community requirements and I'm putting a tree in there and I just don't care. But you should care because, if you look at all these different trees, they all have their different problems. If you're putting in a fruiting tree, you could get into fruit drop. That could attract rats or cockroaches or who knows what, or unwanted birds. Or if you plant a pine tree, you could get needle drop. I hear that a lot about people don't like all the needles dropping off the tree. Or, pigeons coming in and doves coming in, sitting in the tree and defecating on everything underneath them, including your car and your furniture and maybe even you on one of the days. So, you want to look at those things and think about what you're going to plant there. And I know this is a lot to think about. That's why I say it's hard to squeeze everything into 1 hour. But these are things you need to think about. And I believe you're all going to get this presentation, so you'll be able to go back and review some of these slides. So then, basic things, do you want a deciduous or an evergreen tree? So you can grow like a southern live oak or a pine tree or a juniper tree. It's going to be evergreen. And maybe I want that because, if it's beauty or blocking a view. Or I want the leaves to fall off so that in the winter I get sunshine and it helps warm up the house. Or I want an evergreen group of trees to block the wind. And we all know how windy it can be in New Mexico here. So we need to think about that. And you want to always consider the ultimate size of the tree and time. So some of the things that, on the label may say it grows 70 feet tall. But in New Mexico, it may never grow that. It may only grow 30, 40 feet tall because of our weather conditions here. It's too dry and the humidity is too low for that tree to achieve those sizes like it would in East Texas. I know when you plant like a shoe-marred oak, it can grow to 120 feet tall. But I doubt whether one here ever would grow that big just because of our climate restrictions. So those are things to consider. And then you want to consider, do you need a tree to block the view, enhance the view, or is it the only view you're going to have? So I know a lot of new housing areas, the landscapers will go in there and they'll buy like seedling ash and they'll just line every street with seedling ash or whatever you got. The cheapest thing that they can put in there because they're out to make money. And I know my sister moved into a housing area up in Colorado, Denver area, and that's exactly what they did. And I told her, I said, tell them you don't want that tree. That's not a good tree. Get a good tree. She never did it, because she's not a tree person like me. But I would be like, I'm getting rid of that tree. If you're going to walk out that door every day and look at that same tree every day, you might as well enjoy what you're looking at instead of something that somebody put there that's going to be a very unthrifty, unproductive, not a good looking tree with prone to disease and insect problems. So put something in there that you're going to enjoy and not have to worry about. So around here, I've often recommended Keith Davy Chinese pistache because it's a male pistache tree. It colors up early in the fall and turns red. It has very, like nothing almost drops off the tree. It gets a little bit of male flowers dropping in the spring and then the leaves in the fall, but they turn beautiful red so you enjoy it. So you don't have mist. And on top of it all, it's extremely drought tolerant. So those are the things, you can have this beautiful looking tree, but you don't have all the problems. At least we haven't encountered the problems yet. When you overplant something, you can run into problems. So you want to also consider cultivars. And I just mentioned the Chinese pistache, the Keith Davy. You want to have something like that. So if you want an ash tree, you want to look for a name variety because you don't want to get off just seedling varieties sometimes. This is sometimes. So oaks, as a general rule, come pretty true from seed. They do hybridize a lot, but they produce really nice looking trees no matter what almost. But some species of trees just don't look good. So you want to make sure you choose good cultivars. Marisa.
Yeah, you mentioned Chinese pistache, and that was one of our questions from Barry. He asked, is that a good tree for this area? That's in Soledad Canyon near Las Cruces. And I know that up here we recommend Chinese pistache.
Yeah, as long as it's cold hardy in your zone. If you get too far up the mountains, you start getting to, zone 5s or something like that, or 6, it may not thrive very well, and depending on how it grows. And sometimes even if it says the correct zone for your area, you got to consider if it leaves out too early, if it's one of those kind of trees that comes out early and gets frozen every year, that may not be good no matter what. So Chinese pistache are male and female trees, and having a female tree, unless you want a female tree, is not necessarily a good recommendation because the seeds on a female tree, while they attract wildlife, and that may be something you want, they also seed out quite prolifically. And a Chinese pistache is one of those trees that puts down a taproot. And when you go to pull it out, it's going to be difficult. So yeah, choose your trees wisely. Cultivars are great. Okay. Okay, if your neighbor gives you a tree, should you accept it? You really better think about it because you have people giving you invasive trees. I lived in the North Valley of Las Cruces here. My neighbor, his friend gave him tree of heavens. I don't know if anybody knows, probably some of you do know what tree of heavens are. Every seed that falls comes up, and every root that grows suckers a million of them. So, do you really want something like that? I know by the time we moved out of the house next door to him, they were all coming up in our yard. And I was in Tucumcari one time, and I saw this abandoned house, and I should have taken a picture because there must have been 1,000 of these tree of heavens that had sprouted all around the house. So the house was basically abandoned, and all these trees had sprouted. And as dry as it was, they were still growing and thriving. And I know in Albuquerque, a lot of you know about Siberian elms. That's a bad tree. It was called Chinese elm, but there is a good elm called the Chinese elm that's now called lacebark elm, but it's actually the Siberian elm. So you got to watch that. Allergen trees. Maybe your community bans mulberries. I don't think there's anything wrong with mulberries in the right place, in a big park and that where they're not going to be invasive. And I had severe allergies with mulberries, but I found out what was wrong with me, so I don't have that problem anymore. You don't want to plant short-lived trees. By the time you plant the tree and it gets big enough where you start enjoying it, now it's time to cut it down. That's a problem around here with willow trees. They grow really fast, and all of a sudden they're beautiful and they're up there, and now it's time to cut them down because they're full of borers and slime flecks and aphids and Psychospora fungi. So they have problems. So check your area, whether you have problems with those trees. So an elm, I said willow might be great up in the northern part of the state, not have these problems. You get farther north where you have cold periods. Trees with aggressive roots, like a mulberry tree, like the tree of heaven. You've got to be careful with the tree. Try to figure out what the root structure is going to be. Is it going to be a deep-rooted tree? If they have aggressive roots like ashes and mulberries and things like that, you plant them anywhere in your yard, it gets near your sidewalk, up goes your sidewalk. If it's near the foundation of your house, it starts cracking your foundation open of your house, and those things can be very expensive, so you need to consider those. And how insect and disease prone are some of these trees? So that's another point that you want to look at. So I think New Mexico State University, we have information on a lot of this. The Think Trees Conference obviously is going to have information on some of the different trees and what's better to plant. So here's some of a little bit of problem trees, just some pictures to break up the words here. There's on the left, we got an elm tree there growing, and you can see that, how big it's getting. Consider the size of the trunk. The globe willow, Siberian elm fruit. We got this bottom right one. That's not a tree that would grow outside here. That's a ficus tree. So, like a place like California, you plant that, you're going to have a tremendous amount of roots coming up on the surface like that. And then in the bottom left, you see roots in your sewer.
Hey, Jeff, you're 30 minutes in on slide 13.
Wow, this time's going fast.
Yeah.
I need to talk faster or talk less. Now that you've chosen the perfect location, you need to dig the perfect hole. So nowadays they suggest digging a square hole, and that's so that the roots, when they start growing out, don't start growing in a circle. They hit the edges and they tend to grow into the soil area. So you're going to remove, when you go to plant the tree, you want to remove any grass, weeds, rocks, or other debris from the top of that area where you're going to plant. Dig a hole that's no deeper than the container of the bone burlap tree or the roots or the bare root tree. Check for caliche. So you want to put water in there or dig down far enough to know that you don't have caliche under there, because if you do, you're going to have some big problems. The tree will not thrive and eventually die or fall over. Make the planting hole 3 to 5 times wider than the original container. And you really don't need to mend the soil unless there's a very specific reason you need to, because those roots have to grow out into your native soil eventually. And so all the stuff you get when you go to the store, well, you have to add this amendment and that amendment and put this in and that, not necessarily necessary unless you got extremely bad soil and there's a specific reason. Otherwise, choose trees that adapt to your soil. There's digging the hole, planting, make sure that when you plant the tree, it's going to be at the proper depth. If you don't know, on the left is a ball and burlap tree. It's usually wrapped in burlap and either wire or twining around it to hold it together. Containerized tree and a bare root tree. And I know you want to look at the structure of these trees, so you want to make sure, I didn't include much on structure here now. You don't want all branches on one side, or you don't want split forking trees. You know, you want a nicely proportioned. So look at this tree. Most of your trees, you want them to look a little bit like this. So yeah, choose a tree that's in proportion, the tree top with a container. If it's too big on top and a huge big tree in a tiny little container, it's going to be root bound. And let's see, now if you have, you've got the right location, you've dug the hole and cleaned up the area. If you want to plant a ball and burlap tree, you're going to place it into the whole balled and burlap tree into the hole, and you need to remove everything. You want to remove the wire on the outside or the plastic nylon string that's covering it from the top sides and the bottom of the tree. So you want to remove all that and the burlap. And then you want to gently backfill the hole with your native soil. So, and all the time you want to make sure that it's at the correct depth, that you're not burying the trunk deeper than the root flare. And that's right where the roots and the trunk come together. So you want to do that, and you look, let's see, I'm looking to the right at the picture I got coming up, so I'll explain that. Bare root trees, you would dig the hole as the same thing as above. Make sure you not go too deep, and place the tree in the hole, spread out the roots and backfill with the soil. You can mix the soil with water as you're putting it in there, so that slurry of water and soil washes in around the soil, makes direct contact with those bare roots, and that helps water it and remove air pockets so that the soil fills in and stabilizes the tree. Here's a picture of the bolled burlap tree. This is the wrong way to do it. You don't want to leave all these ties on it and just bury it like this. These ties around the base of the trunk are going to strangle the tree there, and as the tree grows, it's just like a noose around the neck. It's going to strangle it so nutrients can't move down from carbohydrates from the sun and the leaves, and nutrition can't move up from the roots and minerals and that, and it's just going to grow bigger and basically strangle till it dies. And then these, if it's in the wire cage and the ball and the burlap, a lot of times that may not break down sufficiently, and then the roots get all balled up in there and the whole tree just dies. So we don't do a lot of ball and burlapping here in New Mexico. Farther up north they do some, but not a lot down in the southern part of the state here. We do more container or bare root. Here's a bare root tree. Good thing, you know, he's dug the hole there, put the shovel across, make sure that the root flare, you can see there right at where the shovel is crossing across the tree, is above there in the graft union. You can kind of see up where that red dot, just below the red dot, is where that graft union is. This is probably a peach tree or something, and putting it into the ground, spreading those roots out. Spreading the roots out is important because you want the roots to get out. If they're all clumped up together, you dig a tiny little hole and you put them all together, the tree will not thrive. Forgive me, I got to drink water. Okay. For containerized tree, now containerized, the ball and burlap and the bare root tree are pretty straightforward. When we get to containerized tree, now that changes a lot. So you're going to go to the store, you got to pick out a tree. It looks really nice on top, but make sure it's not too big for the container. You know, we all want this great big looking tree that we're going to put in there. It's going to look great and beautiful in our yard, but it's got this tiny little root system. So not a good choice. So when you get that containerized tree and you picked out something hopefully in proportion, and you slide that tree out of the root container, you grab it at the base of the tree. Make sure you water the container really well a couple of days before you plant it, so that the tree is hydrated, the soil is hydrated, and it should slip right out of the container. And you want to find nice, clean, white roots, nothing binding up. So that's a good sign of a good tree there, you know, where you don't have black roots and they're all twisting around in a circle. You want them just nice and white, like it was just planted and filled out the container. Okay. Don't take those root bound trees. They're going to be a problem to try and undo the roots, or the tree's going to end up dying if you don't untwist those roots. Once you have all that ready and you're ready to install it, you prepare the hole the same as you did before, and you've taken it out of there, and you can do this up to about a 15-20 gallon size tree. That's pretty easy to do. You know, by the time you get to 20, it's pretty big across, and you might need a couple of people to help you pull it out, but After that, they tend to go to box trees, and then you're going to have to use either a lot of people or a crane to get the tree in. But some of these principles still apply to doing it that way. So one of the options that you can do once you've taken it out of the container, you want to check for the root depth, and then one of the things that I've been saying around here, and that's been really important, is that you take your hose, and this sounds counterintuitive, but you would take the hose and rinse at least half of that soil off the root structure. And I've done this in the middle of summertime when it's been 105 degrees here in Las Cruces. And I do it in the evening, the hole's all ready. I take the hose and I wash part of that soil off so it exposes those roots, and I can see if any are twisted. And then I'll plant the tree. I can spread them out, or I can take my pruners and prune any roots that are crossing that might cause problems in the future. And then I place it in there, and then I backfill with a slurry of water and soil back around that root system. And that works really well because you've made direct contact with those roots. So within a few days, those roots have gotten a signal to start producing new roots. And those new roots are going to go directly out into your native soil. If you don't do this, they're going to stay in that bark mix compost that the tree was grown in, and they don't grow out very well. And that compost root ball also dries out faster than most of the time than your native soil. Unless you got real heavy clay soil, then it can cause the opposite effect and cause a bird bath type problem where water is sealed in there and drowns the plant. But most of the time things dry out too fast, and then I get calls where my tree is drying out, the leaves are all turning brown. I said, well, how long ago did you plant the tree? And they said, well, I planted it a couple months ago and it looked really good. Now it's looking really bad. And it's because water's not getting into the root ball. So that bark mix has dried out, and now you got to try and rehydrate it. And just because you have it on drips doesn't mean it rehydrates that root ball. Just because you water it you got a ring around it and you're flood irrigating it, doesn't mean water went in the root ball. Water is going to go take the easiest path through the native soil and not necessarily go into that root ball. So you need to check that. So if you do this other method, expose part of the roots like that, get them in direct contact with your native soil. When you water and the water goes through your native soil, it goes directly to those roots, and you'll get the tree to take off much quicker. The other thing you can do if you're really afraid to do that, let me change the slide. If you're really afraid to do that, the third step is you can cut what I call a pie wedge. So most people have cut a piece of pie or a piece of cake out of the cake or pie, one piece. And that's what you can do in the container. You can take and cut from top to bottom up to the base of the root flare, remove all those roots in a narrow pie slip that you can get your hand in there. So you break that circling of any roots. And then when you plant it just like everything else, but you put native soil in where you took out the cut. And hopefully that will allow the roots to grow out. Now, doing this method of removing the soil from the roots or cutting into it, you can't always do it to everything. So some of the evergreen things like pines and that, maybe you can do a wedge cut, but you can't bare root them very well. It depends on where you live, but most of the time it's not going to work. Or like if you were doing a specific shrub and certain things you have to learn. You can't always take all the soil off of them. Some plants are real sensitive to that, and there's no way for me to tell you which one unless you ask me directly, hey, I'm planting X plant. I might say, well, yeah, you can't do that to it. Or if you're planting palm trees, I'm one of these people, I love palm trees. So palm trees have very fleshy roots. So their fleshy roots, you don't have to cut. You just need to plant the palm. You don't cut any of those roots, and you just plant it because cutting them doesn't help. And the old ones will kind of disintegrate, new ones will come out. And there are certain palms, if you cut the roots, you almost kill the tree. So, and the same thing with the magnolia. Magnolia has these fleshy roots too, and you don't want to really break any of them. So there's certain specific trees and that you got to be real careful for. But most of your deciduous trees, you can do this method. Here's a picture of some of the roots. So on the on the far right, that one's not too bad. But you can see going from right to left. Now, if you were in the nursery and your people that are planting these trees up don't fix root strangulation or curling roots, look at this. by the time you get all the way to the far left, that was originally like a 2 or 4 inch pot where this tree was growing. And you buy it in a 5-gallon pot and you never know that this was going on underneath in the soil until the tree dies and you pull it out and you see this. So, you know, you want to try and find good trees. You want to look at the base of the stem. If you look closely at the base of the stem on the left, you can see it's twisting around. So don't be afraid to dig down into the container to see where those roots are going, and they should be going out horizontally, not wrapping around in a circle. I hope I'm not beating that horse too much. So you can see, look at this one growing in a pot here on the right. That's pretty bad. That's really bad. And you can see the pine tree on the left-hand side, upper left. So that pine tree, it happens to be an Afghan pine, and wondering why some of them were falling over here in Cruces at one time. It was because they were basically like on the right-hand side, maybe not quite that bad, but they were had root strangulation going on. They were planted in the soil and they got to be big pine trees. They got pretty big, but you know, it took a wind event to twist that and it just broke off. And that's the only thing that was holding it in the ground. So, you know, you could get a 30-foot pine tree, and can you imagine that, you know, breaking off and falling down on your car or kids, or, you know, you don't want any of that. So you need to make sure that the root structure of whatever tree you're going to plant is good and anchored in the ground properly. Here's another example. See the roots like that? Look how much caliper is on that stem of that plant. That's not a good thing when you see that big a caliper and that size of pot, how tiny that pot was. Nope, just because you got a big tree doesn't mean, you know, it's a healthy tree. It may look good on the top, but it's, remember, if it was in a container, it's been fertilized and fed with water on a daily basis to keep it alive due to this kind of root structure.
This is an important topic, Jeff, and we have a couple questions related to this. One, how can you tell on an already planted tree if it has circling roots? My tree was planted 3 years ago and it's still fairly small and hasn't grown much. And then similarly, this true even if when you're planting, you have to end up breaking half the roots of good size. And so those are good questions.
Yeah, I'll take the second one first, just because it's shorter. If you have to break the roots, you bought the wrong tree. You can prune a certain amount of bigger roots if the tree has the ability to regenerate that root system. I mean, I've taken some down pretty far because I had a specific tree I actually wanted, and it was the only one I could find, and I had to literally take an axe to get those roots apart and chop big roots apart. And I did save the tree. It was a maple tree, and I did save it. But that's something you wouldn't do unless you really knew what you were doing. Now, the first one, remind me.
Yeah. How can you tell if a tree that's already planted has circling roots because their tree is 3 years old and it's not growing very?
Yeah, so if it's not growing very well, a lot of times they'll have nutritional problems going on at the same time. And you know, I see people putting iron on trees and iron. Either that tree is not adapted here, but if it is an adaptable tree and normally it's green and it's yellow and having nutritional problems, it may probably have strangulated roots. So it's not, you know, they're not being able to move nutrition up properly into the tree, for one thing. Another thing, if you take the tree and you can, after a couple of years, move it around in the hole, you shouldn't be able to move it within 6 months. It should anchor its roots, and you know, the tree will flex, but the base of the tree where the root flare and the roots are should not move. Now I get this question on like Afghan pines, you know, people say, well, it's leaning. Well, a lot of times Afghan pines grow really fast and the wind kind of gets them a little bit of a lean, but a lot of times that's just normal and it's fine. What you would notice on a big tree, if it's losing ground, so to speak, is the ground starts cracking. So if the wind is blowing from the west and you can find cracks on the west, you can see that the root structure is pulling up. But anytime that tree wiggles around, it should not be wiggling around. You know, early when you first plant it, yeah, that's going to happen, but not after 6 months. It should not be unstable where you can almost pull it out of the ground.
Yeah, and to clarify that, the top of the tree should always be wiggly. It's when you wiggle the top, if you see the ground moving, that is the bad sign, right?
Yes, yes.
And then also, so another thing to consider is that planted too deep. And so are you going to get into some of those? So So the tree could also be not growing because it's planted too deep.
Too
And that
deep.
is related to its rooting, but not necessarily because of circling roots. So
I've gone out on house calls on that one where the tree was actually, it grew for a while. I'm surprised it didn't die sooner. But if you take the root flare where the roots start and the trunk and you put that deeper, it's like if you were in the swimming pool and you got water up to here and you could survive until the water goes up below above your nose and then you can no longer breathe. And that's the same way with the trunk of the tree. Fungal organisms will start coming in. That bark was not meant to be underground and wet all the time. So it starts rotting and decaying and the tree dies. And it may take time. But yeah, planting too deep is no good either. You want to plant it at the correct depth with those roots spread out, and quickly it should take hold. If you've done things right, it'll take hold quickly. And the first year, I always say, it may not look perfect the first year. You know, if you've done everything right, guaranteed it probably isn't going to look perfect if you take it out of a container and that. But the second year, it should just come out beautifully and really take off. Okay, let's see. Okay, so staking, you don't want to really stake trees unless you have to. You know, young trees, usually if they're young enough, they'll stand up on their own, and that movement around, like we were talking with Mauricio, that movement around is necessary to build trunk caliper and stability and strength. Now, if you get a taller tree, you may need a stake, and there are staking standards here from the Arbor Foundation about how to stake a tree, and there's a number of different ways to do that. I was actually watching Gardener's World, which is a program that comes from England. It is excellent, and it's been going for 30 some years, and it's still on TV. And but you can watch it online, and they talk about staking a lot of trees. So in England, they stake them a little differently than we do in America here. We generally do 2 or 3 stakes and give some guys in between there so that the tree and the trunk can move around, but it's not going to blow out. So staking is also important if you're in an area where vandalism could take place or you need to protect the tree till it gets bigger. So there are some things to consider there. But there's a link to the arboricultural site where you can look that up. Like I said, we're going fast with time already, so I don't want to get too in depth on some of these things. Mulches are great. Organic mulches are wonderful. You don't want to pile them up too high around the base of the tree, but they help to hold in moisture. So you can use anything from organic, rock, glass, ground rubber tires, straw, any kind of thing that will help to retain the moisture. The main thing that you want to watch out for is that these don't move off site. So if you put down a fine mulch and it's real windy and it blows away, or if you're on a hill slope and it blows away or washes away, that's not good. I see sometimes crusher fines used, and then the rain comes and it washes it all down the street. So, you know, use the appropriate mulch. You know, if you were on a slope and you're mulching a tree, rock will work. And I know people say rock heats up and everything, and that is true. It usually heats up on the top, but underneath it traps moisture. So if it's thick enough, the thing with mulches, they got to be thick enough, and they need to be 4 to 6 inches deep to help retain moisture underneath there and keep that there. And that also helps keeps the weeds around there away. But when you're using mulches, you got to be careful what you use. You know, for a while there, people are using pecan shells here, and it brings in birds and rats and cockroaches. So be careful what you mulch with so that you don't bring in unwanted insects or animals. And like I said, watch out for the drift. You know, you don't want your mulches going away. And there's some examples. Correct way on the left, top left. And then a lot of, I've seen this in Texas in the Southeast, and that they like to do what they call volcano mulching. And I just can't help but think that is really bad. But it still goes on down there in the Southeast, and I'm not sure why. But that puts moisture right up against that trunk where you shouldn't be doing that, and which can cause a lot of disease problems. Maybe it's to keep the weed whackers away. That's an idea. You know, you don't want weed whackers there either. So the top left with the correct way, if you got a mulch ring around there, those roots can grow and be healthier, and you're not taking the weed whacker up against there and stripping all the bark off the tree. Water properly. I was mentioning that a little bit earlier. You want to make sure, you know, you give that tree really good water for the first full year. And many parts in New Mexico, you need to give it the water for the life of the tree. But some places, you know, to really get it established, you got to make sure it gets water for that first full year, and you got to be out there paying attention. How much water? And nobody can tell you, oh, just water this amount every time. I mean, people could tell you, I guess, but you know, everybody's house is different. Everybody's aspect and the wind and the sun and what you're getting is a little bit different. So you may dry out faster or not dry out as fast. So you need to know your own yard and don't rely on everybody else telling you exactly how much water needs to be there, because irrigation is a hard thing to teach. Drip irrigation is only as good as its designer. So, you know, like I said, if you only put one dripper, and that's one of the big things I see in landscapes, you know, the landscaper put a tree in, they put one dripper on it because the tree was small, and nobody from the next 15, 20 years ever came back and put any more drippers on it. It still has the one original dripper, and whether that works or not, nobody seems to know. So as the tree increases, you have to increase the watering, and you have to move the drippers out to where actually the roots are. They're not right up against the tree. Those roots are suberized. They absorb some water, but they're more likely not to absorb as much water. And like I was saying, you have to have the correct number of drippers, but you might want to also consider micro sprinklers. So these are little drip emitters that put out a fan of water real close to the ground. I know the pecan industry down here over towards Arizona and Texas and places have used micro sprinklers because it'll spread the water out, especially in sandy soil. It'll help spread that water out without spraying it up in the air. It spreads it out so it covers a bigger area so that your tree gets better watering. Here's a example of a tree canopy, and people like to water right up next to the trunk, but you see where the drip line, that's where you minimally need to water. That's where you have to be at the very least out to that area. But look how much farther those roots go out. These roots spread way out all over. That's how the tree stays upright, is because it puts out such a wide rooting zone. So we need to adequately water that. And yeah, I see lots of examples where people with ground covered black plastic yards with rock all over the top, and you know, one or two drips right up by the trunk. And I'm like, well, how do you get water to the rest of the tree? That's why the tree is, you know, dying, because it just doesn't, especially like ash trees. So here's an example of some rings and grids for putting underneath bigger trees. Some of the things that you should do. Coming up close. And the
Jeff,
other
you
thing,
have 5
5
minutes. Sorry.
yeah. Okay, make sure that your timers are set correctly. If it's set for 1 gallon, you know, if you have one example, 1 gallon per hour dripper, and you run it for 15 minutes, you're only getting 1/4 of a gallon or 32 ounces. It's not enough water to water the tree. That gallon isn't enough water, most instances, to water the tree. So set your timer long enough. Remember, it's a drip system. 15 minutes seems like a long time for you, but it's a drip. It's going slowly. So you need to run it long enough to get the benefits of that watering. Otherwise, if you don't, you're just watering the top of the ground and letting it evaporate. You're actually wasting water. I have included a resource here that I thought was excellent. It's Estimating Landscape Tree Water Requirements in the US, Western US. There is a link there that we will provide for you. And it's a really good, you need to read the whole article, and it's a basic guide that was done through research from the University of California on the Western United States about how to water a tree. Basically, how much water does that tree need? So if you look at a tree, you can kind of estimate how much it may need. It may need more than what they say or less. I also included an example here. So this whole example dealt with like a purple leaf plum that was 10 feet by 10 feet wide. You know, that canopy spread was 10 by 10. It doesn't matter the height. It's the canopy of the crown of the tree crown, the leaf spread. So it was 10 by 10, and our evaporation rate here is 93 inches, and putting it through the formula gave a formula number of 29. So now I just tell people, if you take 29 times that canopy diameter, so 10 by 10, 100, 29 times 100, 2,900 gallons. That's how much water the tree needs in a growing season. If you divide that all down, to what the city recommends, like 3 times a week, it meant you need about 33 gallons of water every time you watered the tree 3 times a week. So this is a real helpful guide to look at if you have trouble understanding how much water you need. Be careful of fertilizers. Fertilizers burn. You know, I get this a lot. My tree, the leaves are burning, so I fertilized it. You know, if you got problems with your tree, I'm going to tell you, don't go fertilizing. Find out what's wrong first. So the trouble with this tree, and I got some pictures coming up. It's an ash tree, and this was just recently sent in to me. The trouble with it was that they were fertilizing it and it was too dry. So they're wondering why all the leaves are burning. Fertilizers are salts. Salts hang on to water. So if you fertilize and salt the soil, the salt's going to hang on to the water stronger than the roots can absorb it. And then the tree doesn't have water. And so the tree is going to start declining. It's losing water through its leaves. It's evaporating through its leaves through transpiration. But it's not taking up enough water through its roots because you put too much salt there. So it starts to decline, and then you get into really bad problems. The roots start collapsing and burning, and if they collapse and burn, then you can get fungal disease coming in onto the roots and starts a decline of the tree. So, when you first plant a tree, you want to avoid fertilizing the tree. The first year, if you have really bad soil, like if it was pure sand, you can use a liquid fertilizer, just a mild solution just to encourage it along, you know, or you have some organic matter that you've added into the soil. That's a really good thing to do, but don't overdo it the first year. Mulching in the future is going to be what it needs, and choosing the right tree for the right place. And here's that ash tree. You can see the leaves burning, and I kept saying, just stop what you're doing. Don't be doing this anymore. You know, find out first what's going on. That tree needed water. This tree was actually also getting sprayed by the golf course next door, which uses recycled water with high salt content, was spraying that water onto the leaves, and the leaves were getting an extra dose of salt on the leaves as well, so causing a lot of decline. Okay, so I've reached kind of the end of the presentation. I have a few slides after this that you can look at afterwards that contain some different trees. But if there's any more questions.
Jeff, we do have a few questions for you.
Sure.
One question is, can you explain why painting the trunks of young trees helps to protect from southwest injury?
Sure. So, you know, you want to paint with a light color, and it's usually preferably white, and you want to use a latex paint. Don't use enamel. Use a latex paint, and that what it does is it reflects the sunlight and it keeps that trunk cooler. And by reflecting the light, the trunk doesn't heat up, and that's really can be very beneficial for fruit trees and very thin bark trees early on in their life. Especially in the winter time when we get a lot of southwest injury, the trunk will heat up and then you get a sudden freeze, you know, as the sun sets, and that causes cells to burst open with because of the water in between the cells. So yeah, that can help, and it keeps the sun from heating it up even in the summertime. So you might get better growth until that canopy of the tree spreads out to help shade the tree. Newly planted trees tend to be like that. Now, if it grew there from seed, a lot of times they don't have that problem. But growing in a nursery, they were shaded on their sides, and then you put them out into the full sun. It's kind of like you, if you've been sitting inside all winter and your skin is all pale, and then you go out in our New Mexico sun and sit out there for a couple hours, you're going to be sunburnt. That's what happens.
Next question, is fall the best time to plant trees here? Summers are so hot, it seems to me that fall would allow for better root development before it gets stressed. Any recommendations or thoughts?
Yeah, that is true, depending on the type of tree that you are planting. So if you're planting a marginally hardy tree, you may want to wait till spring. I know we do a lot of that in the southern part of the state because we can plant lemons and grapefruit and stuff like that. So you want to wait till spring. But as a general rule, you know, your cold hardy trees, especially your deciduous, are good to plant in the fall. You can choose your tree, you can bare root it, you can get it in, and those roots actually grow all winter because the soil is going into the fall, the soil is still warm. The root, you still have active growth of the roots, even though you're not getting leaves and top growth. Those roots will grow and start anchoring into the ground, and you'll get mild growth once the root system when it's really cold. But the root systems don't really shut down totally underground here unless you get deep ground freezing.
So when planting trees in native soil without soil amendment sounds like a great idea, but what if nothing has ever been grown there before, or it's devoid of any vegetation? I have heavy clay soil for at least 2 feet. Should I dig down to sand, or should I fill the hole with amendments? What would you recommend?
So I've often said that one of the most difficult soils to grow in is heavy clay, because you think you could grow something in there, and most of the times it doesn't work out. If you have caliche, you know you can't grow, and there are other problems too. But heavy clay, you keep thinking you're going to be able to grow. Now, it's not impossible to grow things. There are certain plants that do better in heavy clay and are able to thrive in there, like a mulberry. Peach trees actually seem to do well in heavy clay. But you know, depending on how big an area, you can amend it with organic matter. One of the few things that will open up clay is a lot of organic matter, depending on how deep that clay is. And I know around here they do grow pecans in heavy clay, but you got to have the drainage. So heavy clay is a very difficult soil. It depends on, like I said, what kind of plant you want to grow in there, what kind of tree. So try to find trees that are adapted to growing into heavy clay. And there are lists of trees that will grow in heavy clay.
And just to add something with that, I would say mixing the organic matter with the native soils is best. Don't backfill solely with organic matter, so that way the trees start circling their roots.
Absolutely, yeah, you need to mix it all together. Thanks,
Uh,
Jeff.
What about water permeable landscape or ground cloth under the mulch?
Yeah, that works really well. I have no problems with that as long as you can deal with your irrigation system. So that's highly dependent on your irrigation system. If you put down landscape fabric, yes, water goes through there. You can put mulches, rocks, and that over the top. But if you have to do anything with the irrigation system, you need to know where it is or how to expand it without digging up your whole yard, like all the rock and all the landscape fabric. So you need to plan, do more planning if you're going to put down landscape fabric, planning for the future.
Another question is, I lost several small trees to gopher and moles eating the roots. I've been told to use chicken wire in the hole when I plant the replacement tree to prevent them from eating the roots. Is this a valid suggestion?
I'd say no. Tree roots are going to get big and they're going to get entangled in that chicken wire, and that could cause problems. I would recommend it. I'd find a way to get rid of the gophers. There's got to be a way to get rid of the gophers, and Sam Smallage, our specialist here, would probably have good ideas on that. But yeah, I'm not. You can do cages for bulbs and small things, but for large rooted trees, that's an obstruction that you wouldn't want to do.
Which
Maybe,
mulch?
maybe one of the things that you might be able to do is plant daffodils around the roots. I don't know if that would work, but daffodils are poisonous, and they may avoid the area around the tree if enough daffodils are there.
Which mulches are best for not attracting pests?
Mostly non-organic. So rock, well, rock will take in things like the livid rock. Everything's going to have its problem. I have glass mulch. I don't get anything in there. It depends on a lot of it depends on the size. The smaller the size, the less things, there's less hiding spaces for insects and that. And again, like I said, you know, like pecan shells and that may attract rats and rodents. So yeah, everything's going to have some kind of an attractant. I mean, you get an ecosystem really built up there. So I have a lot of rock that I put in. and larger rocks. So I have lizards and geckos that take care of any of the insect problems. And, you know, I have established, and it's a good idea to think about establishing a habitat where, yeah, you get some bad insects, but you bring in the good insects and you bring in the good lizards and that feed on them, and birds and things like that. So it's a balance. So you, even though there might be some bad, it's all good in the end.
And last question that I can see is, what about planting on a high berm landscape on an otherwise flat yard or landscape? What will the roots do, and will they be damaged, or will they find the plane to get deeper down?
So that depends on the kind of tree or plant that you're planting up on a berm. So I actually have some berms in my yard, and I do have palm trees on there, and palm roots will grow 12 to 15 feet deep. So they're rooted down deep below the height of my berms. It depends on how high your berms are too. But I made the berms, and I've covered them with rock, and they have the palms, and I have different plants woven in between, creating that ecosystem. But yeah, if you're going to plant on a berm, you want to have a good mulch that's going to stay in place. And I personally think boulders work really well. And you need to supply some kind of irrigation. And it all depends on what you intend to plant on that berm.
So thank you all for attending. Jeff, thank you very much for presenting today. And good luck with all of your trees, planting and taking care of them. And keep them watered for the winter. Water, water, water. So thank you for attending, everyone.